Hey y'all, Will here. Just a quick note. This is a very rough cut of this episode. Election is right around the corner, and so I wanted to get this episode on voting out just as soon as I could. So apologies for some of the unfinished edges, but I'll come back after election season's done and give it the proper treatment that it deserves. But for now, here we go. The vote. The bedrock of democracy itself. And yet somehow the very idea that people in a democracy should vote is controversial. For as many reasons as people can readily name to vote,
for the free and secret ballot is the real keystone of our American constitutional system.
there seem to be just as many reasons not to.
The act of voting does not a good citizen make, and it's actually one of the least effective ways you can contribute to the American experiment.
Whatever our position about voting, we get really invested in how it's done, by whom, etc. And sometimes we can get a little judgy.
Don't boo, vote.
Political scholars, philosophers, and others have been back and forth about whether or not voting is worth it. The vast, vast majority of the analyses all have one thing in common, though. They're built around the assumption that the only thing that matters in voting is whether or not your vote counts. That is to say, whether or not the candidate or outcome that you favored wins. It turns out, however, that voting matters and benefits you, no matter what the outcome of the election is. You heard me correctly. Even if the candidate you vote for loses, you still get something from voting. Cash money. Well, okay, you don't get the money, at least not directly, but your community does. Intrigued? We'll stick around and I'll break it all down for you. And if you've decided to become a voter, we'll explore how you can make sure that you get the most bang for your Tuesday night. This and more in this chapter of The American Democracy, a User's Manual. Welcome to The American Democracy, a User's Manual. I'm Will, or if we're going to be formal about it, Dr. Walker. I have a PhD in law and public policy, and this series is where I put that expertise to work for you. Just like the user manual on your car, which would help you change a flat tire or your oil or tell you what that blinking light on your dashboard means, this series is intended to help you understand what levers and buttons of government you have access to as just a normal citizen and how and when to pull them. Democracies work best, of course, when everybody's involved, so please like, subscribe, leave me some comments, questions, or whatever you've got. I do read all comments. And share this video with your friends and this channel in general. The more exposure that we can get, the more people I can get giving me feedback, the better this series will become for everybody. So here it is. Voting. The foundation of citizen political power. The final word when a politician is up for a performance review. For most people, the reasons to vote boil down to one of two things. Either you're showing up to get your candidate into office or get the other guy out of office. Bam, done. If that's it. If you're not showing up to win, don't show up at all. But by that logic, you'd basically never have a reason to show up and vote. Democracy itself becomes a self-contradiction. The odds that your one vote just happens to be the vote that decides the matter is vanishingly small. So small, in fact, that researchers have wrestled with the fact that it's obviously not worth the time if that's the reason you're going. But before you say, thanks, Will, and then turn off the video, understand that the people who think about elections this way have it very, very wrong. Because you as a voter have direct control over a piece of information that legislators in particular, but also governors and presidents, pay very, very close attention to. Turnout. Turnout is the people who showed up. Turnout is the percentage of people who would be eligible to register to vote who actually voted in a given election. Yes, it's a fraction of a fraction, but it's the important slice of the pie. While theoretically any citizen who's eligible to vote could help a candidate win office, turnout tells politicians who actually does. The single most powerful predictor of someone's likelihood to vote is whether or not they voted in the last election, and especially if they voted in the last primary or midterm. Turnout is measured all the way down at the precinct level, but for a variety of reasons it is most relevant at the county level. Because politicians know which counties have higher turnouts, they know which side of the toast their butter is on. They care about those counties because those are the counties that can vote them back into office. These are the counties they'll work hard to get resources to flow into. And the easiest resource to move? Money. Depending on how you want to calculate it, the value of a single vote represents to you, the voter, somewhere between 500 and 300,000 Yeah, really. It's not the kind of bet that pays off very often, but when it does, oh man, does it pay off big. There are millions of Americans right now who have health insurance because Obama won the White House and the Affordable Care Act became law. There's a bunch of very wealthy people and some mega corporations that got massive tax breaks because Trump won the White House. All of the votes that tallied up on the side that won those presidencies and the legislatures that followed them deserve a fair share of the credit for making those realities happen. The United States budget is a few trillion with a T dollars. And yeah, okay, most of that is locked in to keep the lights on and the bombers gassed up and whatever, but hundreds of billions of dollars is still up to be moved around by the winners of an election. And when you divide hundreds of billions of dollars by tens of millions of votes, you get tens of thousands of dollars per vote. Yeah, these are some seriously huge numbers. Okay, maybe that's a little abstract. The human brain doesn't handle numbers like trillions very well. And it's not like we can measure realities that never happened, so we can't actually do a direct comparison here. So let's focus on something we can measure. Let's focus on something a little more human scale and concrete. Politicians want to keep their jobs. That's why they do them. They like their jobs. That means they want to get reelected. To do that, they support policies and programs that benefit their constituents. But they also have limited resources. So they focus those benefits on areas that have the highest turnout, because that's where they have the highest number of people who are actually showing up and, voting. So check this out. In 1933, the FDR administration and its New Deal created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA. FERA's job was to give a bunch of money to state and local governments to create an unskilled jobs so that people who were unemployed as a result of the Great Depression could start going to work, start getting money, and start spending that money and get the economy going again. Over the 2 years that it existed, FERA handed out what would be today $55 billion. So where did that money go? Wouldn't you know it, it happened to find its way especially to the counties and to the states where there were lots of people turning out to vote, and especially those people who would be likely to vote for FDR. The evidence of this is so strong that one study was able to calculate just how much money flowed to a county as a result of just one person deciding to go to the polls and vote. $30. $30 in 1930. Adjusted for inflation, votes today are each worth north of somewhere around $550 in federal funding that goes to those communities. So even if voting takes you all day, $500 some odd coming home to your community is a tidy sum for a day's work, unless you're making $100 an hour or something like that. It is important to recognize that, yes, the actual value of a vote varies from state to state, precinct to precinct. It can change year to year or with what the turnout is, but the averages in this study were fairly tight, and this is also controlling for other things that might have an influence on that value. Okay, well, I hear a theoretical version of you saying, so it happened once in the 1930s, so what? Yeah, no, more than once. Early 2000s. This is the W. Bush administration. Bush starts a strategy called compassionate conservatism. This is on paper your standard issue Republican cut social services that they're famous for, but Bush had won the White House on the kind of razor-thin margins that gets you landed in front of the Supreme Court. So in order to make the whole thing palatable and not just doom him to not being reelectable, instead they took a bunch of the money that they were cutting and they sent it as discretionary grants to churches and other community organizations. I believe the term they had was faith-based community organizations. This is also part of W's general idea that the religious institutions in the government should get a lot cozier than they were at the time. It's absolutely indisputable that this money went to help especially poor people and generally people who were struggling, and it did a lot of good. It is equally undeniable that this money was targeted at particular counties, particular demographics that the Bush campaign was going to need if they were going to win re-election for a second term. You know what? One more? Let's do one more. Okay. In 1965, the Voter Rights Act was signed into law. The biggest thing that it did was it removed many of the just spectacular obstacles that were keeping black people in the South from being able to register to vote or even vote. Most of the voter suppression tactics that were vogue at the time were made illegal, and the federal government stepped in to remove them. This meant that black voters were now able to register, and their rate of registration just skyrocketed. You know what else followed? The money. In exactly the same proportion that blacks were now registering and voting, federal money and state money were going to their counties in, frequently neighborhoods that were grossly underfunded at the time. They were starting to get their fair share of the sort of social services pie, to the point where even folks like segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, George Wallace, and Strom Thurmond. These are two of the most racist men to ever hold public office in the United States of America. They started to support programs that were sending federal and state money into mostly black neighborhoods because they needed to curry favor with those voters. That means that even if your candidate loses, even if you hate the person on the other side, just the fact that you showed up to vote, they have to notice that. They see where the turnout is. It's kind of like a census, where the census counts all of the people in the United States. Voter turnout is a count of the people who show up and vote. In other words, it's a count of the people who can end a politician's career. Oh yeah, they care about that. So it may seem really obvious, but to be a voter, you have to actually vote. There's more to this than meets the eye, though. Voting is more than just a way to be counted by politicians. It's also the way that you protect your power to vote. There's a reason that when Reconstruction was brought to an end after the Civil War, the number one priority among Southern whites was to suppress the black vote. The fewer blacks that voted, the easier it was to pass more laws that further disenfranchised black voters. Once that ball gets rolling, it is much more difficult to get those votes back than it would have been if you had managed to hold on to them in the first place. To be clear, I'm not blaming the black communities that were being brutally oppressed in any of this. But the whole point of that strategy was because they recognized that if they could take the vote away, then they would be able to keep it away. And for the longest time, they did. Blacks had to endure absolutely horrific, bloody abuses in order to get the vote back at all in 1965. So the best way to safeguard your power as a citizen, the best way to keep the vote, is to use it. To be a voter, you have to be registered as one, usually at least a month before a given election. The process for registration differs from state to state, and some states allow same-day registration. Every local government, every town or city government has an elections commissioner or some equivalent thereof. So you contact your city hall, your town hall, or whatever you happen to have that's like that in wherever you live. And you can learn about the requirements and the process to register, what the deadlines are, so that you can vote in your jurisdiction. Different states have different rules about identification that's required to vote. And I'm going to put a link at the bottom of the screen here right now, and it'll also be in the show notes where you can find out what your state's specific rules and requirements are. If you live in a state that requires photo identification, make sure you have that photo identification. Making a plan to vote makes it much more likely that you'll follow through and actually vote. Your plan needs to answer 3 questions. First, it needs to answer, when will you vote? This is more than just the day, right? The day of the election is going to be screamed from the rooftops by campaigners and election officials for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. You'll know what day the election is. This is what time of day. Is that day a work day for you? And if it is, are you going to go before work or are you going to go after work? Remember that the polls close at some point, so if you work a night shift, you better go before. You can also go during. Election laws make it, illegal for your boss to keep you from voting. But employers sometimes like to know if you're going to vote. They don't want everybody to go vote at once, so they want you to have a sign-up sheet or whatever. Talk to your boss, find out what that needs to do if you're going to have to vote during the workday. Of course, early voting. Now you do have to pick a day, and if you have the day off or otherwise don't have work that day, that doesn't always work in your favor. I mean, for me, it works kind of like my laundry. I'll be like, oh, I'll take care of it. And then 8 o'clock rolls around and now it's too late. I can't do my laundry because it'll make noise. You can't go vote because polls are closing already. So you definitely want to make sure that you pick a specific time and hold yourself to it. Go out and do that thing. You also have to know where you're going to vote. You can generally look up your polling location on your state website. You can also usually call your town officials, find out what specific precinct you're going to be voting in, how you get there, look it up on Google Maps. Do this at least a couple of weeks in advance. Look up how you're going to get there. What's the route? Are you taking the bus? Are you walking? Are you driving? Are you going with friends or neighbors? Make sure you know what that route is. If you're taking a car, make sure you know where you're going to park or roughly where you're going to look for parking. Finally, you need to know how you're going to vote. I don't mean in terms of like absentee versus in person or early versus whatever. I'm talking there's going to be a ballot in front of you and you're going to be asked to make a series of choices. And that ballot is decided in advance. You can get a copy of that ballot and you can get what's called a voter's guide, which has a bunch of analysis on it. You can look at the choices you'll be asked to make and you can decide in advance what choices you're going to make, how you're going to vote, which votes you're going to cast for whom when you get there. You can always change your mind, but by deciding ahead of time, you avoid the situation where you're sitting there looking at a ballot going, what do I even do? You know what you're going to do. You can walk in, bang, 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 run it through the machine. You're done. You're out. And you vote very, very quickly and very efficiently that way. So when are you going to vote? Where are you going to vote? And how are you going to vote? So does voting matter? You betcha. And honestly, in a lot of ways that many of us haven't even considered. I hope that you've stuck with me and picked up something or learned something new along the way that'll help you get the most out of how you vote. Leave a comment with your questions, suggestions for future topics, feedback, critiques of how I do these videos, and especially if you have decided to become a voter, tell me. Leave it below in the comments. If you like this project and you want to help support me, please like and subscribe, and then share this video widely with your friends, your family, your coworkers, everybody. That's how I build this project, and right now it's the most important thing that I can be doing. And honestly, also these likes and shares and subscribes, and they're what keep me going. Those little drip drops of external validation, that sweet, sweet dopamine. I'm Will Walker. Stay safe, be smart. Remember, you have power, and always read the manual.